In the autumn of 1861, beneath a harvest moon swollen with amber light, a woman named Miriam Candle crossed the footbridge over Caro Hollow for the final time. Those who saw her from afar described her as moving slow, deliberate, like someone walking into memory rather than out of it. She held a brass lantern cupped between her hands, its flame flickering low, cradled against the wind like a dying secret. Draped over her shoulders was a shawl of dark wool, frayed at the hem, and wrapped in her arms were two daughters, swaddled in patchwork quilts sewn from the faded silk of her wedding dress. But no record of her marriage ever existed. Not in the chapel registry, not in the township ledgers, not even whispered among the elder women who remembered every birth, every death, every vow. The bridge beneath her creaked as if groaning in protest. The river below churned slow and black, carrying the scent of iron and alder bark. The lantern dipped once as Miriam paused at the center of the span. Some say the flame bowed to the water or to something beneath it. Others say it simply sputtered as if gasping before continuing its solemn glow. By morning, the quilts were found on the far bank, folded neatly, still warm to the touch. The lantern sat between them, extinguished, cold, its glass unbroken. No one ever found Miriam. But just before dawn, two girls emerged from the tree line. Mercy and Temperance Candle, barefoot, silent, their dresses smeared with soot, their hair tangled with ash. Their hands were slick with wax, stained the pale color of tallow. When the sheriff asked where they had gone that night, neither child answered. They only lifted their palms, facing outward, still trembling, as if showing wounds too recent to explain. The sheriff recoiled. One of the deacons crossed himself, and the midwife who once cradled them as infants whispered, "They were returned," but not unchanged. The village priest, Reverend Josiah Fitch, took the girls into his care. He had no wife, no children of his own, and no illusions about the burdens of his calling. His rectory sat at the edge of the village, hemmed in by blackthorn and briar, flanked on one side by a crumbling orchard, and on the other by the shuttered chapel of St. Ivan's Mercy. He claimed the sisters rarely spoke, and when they did, their voices braided together in such uncanny harmony that it seemed one spirit spoke through both mouths. He often woke in the night to the whisper of bare feet crossing the stone floor, followed by the soft creak of the chapel latch being drawn open. Once he followed, but the hall was empty save for two taper candles. Burning low in the iron sconces, their flames bowed toward the altar, as though answering a silent summons. There was no sound, no chant, no presence, only the scent of melted wax and something older than fire, older than faith. In the autumn of 1861, beneath a harvest moon swollen with amber light, by the first frost, the Candle Sisters had become a fixture of the rectory. They moved like shadows, present yet never fully seen. Reverend Fitch, once a man of calm ritual and confident sermon, found himself rattled by their presence. Not frightened. No, that would have been simpler. What he felt was worse, a deep, unnerving reverence. As if these children had come from somewhere sacred and wrong. He kept a ledger of daily observances, as all priests in the region did. But his entries began to blur into something more than record-keeping. On November 9th, he wrote, "The girls woke before the bell. I found them kneeling in the orchard, palms down, eyes shut. No words were spoken. Their breath fogged in the cold, but their fingers did not tremble. I think they were listening." The orchard behind the rectory had long been considered barren. Dead trees, brittle branches, soil gone to dust. Yet the twins visited it each morning, moving between the skeletal trees as if retracing invisible steps. They never picked the apples that failed to ripen, never disturbed the dirt. They only knelt. One morning, Fitch watched them from the parlor window hidden behind the curtains. The girls circled a leafless tree at the far edge of the grove, its bark charred black, struck once by lightning decades prior. Together they placed their hands against its trunk and whispered in unison, mouths barely moving. A soft gust of wind swirled around them, though the rest of the world remained still. He never asked what they prayed to. The villagers began to murmur. Some claimed the girls were touched by divine sorrow, sent as omens before the coming war. Others whispered that Miriam Candle had made a pact, beneath the harvest moon, offering her body to the hollow and her daughters to something far older. A few even claimed to see her wandering the woods, drifting between the trees in a gown of smoke, her face hollowed like a burned-out lantern. It was Mrs. Rourke, the apothecary's widow, who first claimed to smell them before she saw them. Beeswax and sorrow, she told the pastor's wife. Like a funeral soaked in honey. That same night, dogs howled through the hollow, and the chapel's bell rang once, though no one pulled the rope. Inside the rectory, the sisters sat side by side on the old velvet settee, a single candle resting on their clasped hands. The flame danced unnaturally tall, casting shadows that flickered across the walls, shadows that moved against the light rather than with it. When Reverend Fitch stepped into the room, they turned to him with identical expressions, not sadness, not joy, but something deeper, as if they recognized something in him even he had forgotten. He asked what they were doing. They said nothing, but the candle flickered once, then stilled, and when he looked again, he could have sworn the flame had taken the shape of an open eye. By December's second week, the hollow had frozen beneath a sheet of silent snow. No birds, no wind. Even the river below the old bridge flowed, beneath ice so thick it held the shape of last. Autumn's leaves within it, as if time itself had been paused by unseen hands. And still the Candle Sisters walked barefoot through it all, never wincing, never falling ill. Their feet left no tracks. Reverend Fitch could no longer tell when they slept. He'd wake at odd hours and hear the faint shuffle of their footsteps echoing through the rectory's long corridor. Sometimes he would catch a glimpse of their pale silhouettes at the far end of the hall, always just before they turned the corner and vanished into the chapel. He began locking the chapel doors at night. They unlocked themselves. Once, he stood before the chapel threshold and listened. There were no chants, no cries, only the steady drip of melted wax and the subtle hiss of flame. He opened the door slowly. The sisters were not there, yet 2 candles burned upon the altar, and the scent of scorched linen lingered in the pews. The chapel had always been modest: stone walls, oak rafters, iron sconces, and a crucifix carved by blind monks decades ago. But now the shadows moved strangely along the walls, and the Christ above the altar seemed to lean subtly toward the flickering flames, his wooden eyes sinking deeper into their sockets each passing night. Fitch wrote in his ledger again, "They leave no soot upon the floor, no wax upon the cloth, only warmth like a fire recently departed, and sorrow thick as ash." On December 17th, he followed them silently as they drifted into the chapel just before the hour of 3. They did not see him. He watched as they stood before the altar and raised their hands. No candles were lit, but as their palms lifted, flames appeared, hovering, suspended just above their skin. They did not burn. The flames danced as if breathing, illuminating the girls' faces with a flickering gold that made their eyes seem deeper, hollow, eternal. They did not pray. They simply watched, and the flames responded, twisting and bending toward the altar, toward the crucifix, toward something unseen. Then, without a word, the sisters turned and walked past him. Their eyes met his, not with fear, not even with recognition, with mourning. That night, Fitch dreamed of a field full of candles, thousands, burning in silence. No wind, no sound. But something moved through them, a figure in a veil of smoke, cradling a lantern that bled wax like tears. He woke with wax dried on his hands. The chapel door was open again, and the candles inside were still warm. As Epiphany approached, the village prepared for their candlelit procession, a tradition older than the parish itself. Every window glowed with soft amber light. Each doorway bore a taper bound in red ribbon. Yet the rectory remained dark, its curtains drawn, its windows unlit. That was how the rumors began. Children whispered that the Candle Sisters burned their own light, and needed none from wax or oil. One boy swore he saw them standing at the second-story window, their hands held up to the pane, not touching it, but warming it somehow, until the frost pulled away in tiny beads and wept down the glass. Another claimed that on cold nights, the rectory windows glowed, not gold, but red, not flickering, but steady, as if fire lived behind the walls, held in check only by silence. A widow named Elsie Brewer, known for her stubbornness and good tea, decided to investigate. On the evening of January 10th, she passed by the rectory just after Vespers. Snow crunched beneath her boots and her shawl clung to her skin with cold damp. She walked slowly, deliberately, pretending to admire the moonlight. Then she saw it. A single window on the second floor pulsed red, not candlelight, not hearthlight. Something deeper, thicker, as if the wall itself bled beneath the glass. She stepped closer, squinting, unsure. That was when she saw them. The Candle Sisters seated side by side, their faces pale and serene, their hands resting in their laps, and between them, a candle that burned with a flame too long, too still, It rose upward in a perfect line, unmoving, its base glowing like coals. And behind them, though the room held no furniture, shadows swayed, slow and rhythmic like mourners behind a veil. Elsie opened her mouth to scream, but nothing came out, not even breath. Her shawl fluttered. Her bones chilled. Her throat seized in place. It was only when she stumbled backward and fell into the snow that the air returned to her lungs like a slap. She crawled until she could run. She told no one that night. But days later, over tea and trembling hands, she confessed to the pastor's wife, whispering, "Their candle doesn't need to be lit, it chooses to burn." Back inside the rectory, Reverend Fitch continued his notes. The entries had grown stranger, less scriptural. "I dream in wax. They do not eat. They do not age. They do not forget. The house is no longer mine." He kept the ledger locked beneath the floorboard, beside the original chapel key and the last letter he ever wrote to the bishop. He never sent it. By the time it was finished, his pen had melted slightly at the tip, as though held too close to flame. He hadn't lit a fire that night. And yet his room was warm. On the night of January 14th, the wind changed. For weeks, the air had smelled of pine and coal dust, but now it carried something heavier, sweet, thick, clinging, like oil poured over roses. It slid into homes beneath doorframes. It curled beneath collarbones. And when villagers lit their lamps that evening, the flames sputtered as if choking. That same night, a fire was set. The origin remains unclear. Some say it began in the abandoned stable beside the rectory. Others swear it started in the chapel rafters, but the villagers saw it. The glow, the rising plume, the shape of something unnatural behind the flame. They raced up the hill with buckets, blankets, and prayer. But when they arrived, there was no smoke. No fire, not even heat. The chapel stood as it always had, quiet, still, unbothered by the panic below. But the walls were blackened at the base, as if something had licked them, then stopped. The snow had melted in a perfect ring around the building, revealing dead earth underneath, steaming, and the windows glowed with a faint red pulse. Inside, the pews were undisturbed, the crucifix untouched, but the altar cloth had vanished, burned completely without ash. In its place lay a single taper, still warm to the touch, its wick unlit, its base embedded into the wood. Reverend Fitch arrived last, breathless and bareheaded, a robe clutched over his nightclothes. He saw the villagers standing in silence and pushed through them. When he crossed the chapel threshold, he stopped. The Candle Sisters were there, already seated in the front pew, as if they had always been, as if they had never moved. Their dresses were singed at the hem. Their hair smelled faintly of smoke, but their faces bore no fear, only stillness, and something ancient. He stepped forward and asked, voice low, "Did you see it?" They turned to him slowly. In unison, Mercy blinked once. Temperance did not blink at all. Then both raised their hands. Their palms were unburned, but stained black. Not with soot, with something deeper, something that had soaked into the skin and would never come out. That night, Reverend Fitch wrote only one sentence in the parish ledger. The fire was not to consume, but to cleanse. He did not ring the chapel bell the next morning, and from that day forward, no flame in the village would light on the first strike. Not hearth, not stove, not lamp. Every match must be struck twice, every prayer whispered twice, as if something unseen required confirmation. The villagers grew cautious. They avoided the chapel path after dusk, and the children no longer played in the snow near the rectory gate. They said the ground was too warm, and that when you leaned in close enough, you could hear something beneath it, breathing. 3 nights after the fire that wasn't, something returned to Caro Hollow that hadn't been seen in years, the fog. Not the gentle mist that rolled in with spring. No, this fog came from the ground, thick, low, and oily. It crawled across the fields like spilled milk and clung to the hedges like wet wool. By midnight, it swallowed roads, fences, even sound, and just before dawn, it brought something else. At the edge of the orchard, in the cleft between 2 frost-stripped sycamores, Reverend Fitch found a girl. She was no older than Mercy and Temperance, maybe younger. Her dress was hand-sewn, but the fabric was wrong, too coarse, too old. Her hair hung long, damp with dew, tangled with bits of briar. She did not speak. He found her standing still, barefoot, eyes wide. The veil she wore, yes, a veil, was torn and stained at the hem, woven from what looked like dried thorns and silk thread. She did not flinch when he approached. did not shiver, only blinked once and held out a single hand, as though offering herself or asking something in return. He did not take it. He led her to the rectory, wrapped her in a shawl, offered her food. She did not eat. She did not give a name. But when the Candle Sisters entered the room, they stopped at once, and the girl finally moved. She stepped forward, veil dragging behind her like a memory, and joined them, one on either side, without a word. From that moment on, she was part of them. The village called her Aisling, though no one knew why. The name was never spoken aloud. It simply settled. Aisling did not speak, even in whispers. But when she walked, wax trailed behind her feet like slugs through snow. She slept curled beneath the altar, and she carried always a tiny stub of a candle, burned down past half its life, wrapped in cloth tucked against her ribs. The sisters never left her side. One evening, the pastor's wife, fearing for Fitch's health, arrived with soup and worry. She knocked, entered uninvited, and found the three girls seated in a triangle on the floor of the chapel. Each held a candle. None were lit. Yet the light in the room was pulsing. Red, soft, alive. She dropped the soup. The bowl shattered and the light went out. The sisters looked up at her with mild surprise, as if waking from prayer. But Aisling turned her face away, and for a brief second, beneath her veil, the pastor's wife swore she saw a mouth stitched shut with threads of gold. She ran. Reverend Fitch did not follow. He simply knelt in the hallway, eyes wide, breath thin, scribbling again into his ledger. 3 now, a trinity without a priest, or perhaps without need of one. The rectory, like many built in that age, was raised slightly above ground, its stone foundation creating a shallow crawl space, no taller than a grown man's shoulders. Most forgot it existed. Even Reverend Fitch had only glanced into it once during his first month. When a pipe burst and the floorboards had warped, he remembered the scent, wet earth and candle wax, as if something had already been burning down there for a long time. He never went back, until Aisling began disappearing. She would be there one moment, kneeling at the altar, fingers pressed into the stone, and then gone, utterly, as if the room had swallowed her. No door opened. No latch turned. She simply faded, sometimes for hours, sometimes for a day. The Candle Sisters never blinked, never asked where she went. On the night of January 23rd, the floor beneath the rectory groaned. The sound came not from weight, but from movement. Slow, pulsing, rhythmic. Like breathing through soil. Fitch lit a taper and followed the sound to the edge of the cellar hatch, tucked beneath the worn carpet of the study. He hesitated, then opened it. The air that rushed out was warm, damp, and not entirely air. It smelled of melted fat and damp linen. Wax and bone. He climbed down slowly, the wooden ladder shaking beneath his weight. The crawl space had changed. It was no longer a narrow passage of stone and cobweb. Something had carved a hollow space beneath the chapel, rough but intentional. The soil had been smoothed into walls, curved in a perfect oval like the inside of a womb. At the center sat Aisling, alone. She knelt in a ring of melted candles, 40, maybe more, each burned halfway, then snuffed. Around her were small objects Fitch could not identify, lengths of hair braided and tied, a rosary with no cross, pages of hymns with the notes scratched out, all gently swaying, though there was no wind. On the final day of January, the hollow fell unnaturally quiet. Birds did not sing. No smoke curled from chimneys. Snow remained untracked. It was as if the village had agreed, without speaking, to hold its breath. The Candle Sisters had not been seen in 2 days. Aisling neither. Reverend Fitch did not ring the chapel bell that morning. He sat at his desk, staring into the flame of a candle that burned without sound, without smoke. It did not flicker when he breathed. It did not lean toward wind. He had tried to write, but the ink thickened in the bottle. The pages refused his pen. Even the leather-bound parish ledger lay shut, as if it too had decided the story had gone far enough, and yet he knew it hadn't. That evening, just before twilight, the fog returned. Thicker than before. This time it brought whispers. The villagers heard them through walls, beneath floorboards. Some said they came from drains, others from the fireplace. But the words were always the same, repeating like prayer. One to carry flame, one to bear the smoke, one to close the eye. It was Elsie Brewer who saw them first. She had risen early to tend her husband's grave, only to find 3 figures at the chapel's entrance, veiled, unmoving. Each held a candle. Each wore a different color of linen, white, red, and black. The fabric looked hand-dyed and ancient. The snow melted beneath their feet in small circles of steam. She said nothing. She turned and walked home, locked every door, doused every lamp. By nightfall, others saw the procession. The three girls walked slowly from the chapel toward the orchard, the candles in their hands glowing with unnatural steadiness. No wax dripped. No wind touched them. Behind them followed a line of shadows, dozens, silent and robed as if summoned from soil. They bore no faces, no steps, but the snow flattened beneath their passing. And above them, the sky took on a sickly hue, neither night nor twilight, but a stained shade of rust and bruised plum. The moon did not rise. At the center of the orchard, the girls stopped. There was no ceremony, no chanting. But every villager who later claimed to have watched from windows or from the edges of trees agreed on what they saw. The girls knelt. Each placed her candle in the soil. Then they vanished. Not all at once, but like fire snuffed beneath a bell jar, slow, shrinking, then gone. The candles remained. They burned until morning, but by dawn they too had vanished. In their place were 3 holes in the earth, small, perfectly round, smoldering at the edges. Fitch found them himself. He knelt beside the deepest one and listened. At first nothing. Then, faint from far below, he heard what sounded like breath. Breath not drawn in, but held. On the final day of January, the hollow fell unnaturally quiet. Birds did not sing. No smoke curled from chimneys. Snow remained untracked. It was as if the village had agreed, without speaking, to hold its breath. The Candle Sisters had not been seen in 2 days. Ashleen neither. Reverend Fitch did not ring the chapel bell that morning. He sat at his desk, staring into the flame of a candle that burned without sound, without smoke. It did not flicker when he breathed. It did not lean toward wind. He had tried to write, but the ink thickened in the bottle. The pages refused his pen. Even the leather-bound parish ledger lay shut, as if it too had decided the story had gone far enough, and yet he knew it hadn't. That evening, just before twilight, the fog returned. Thicker than before. This time it brought whispers. The villagers heard them through walls, beneath floorboards. Some said they came from drains, others from the fireplace. But the words were always the same, repeating like prayer. One to carry flame, one to bear the smoke, one to close the eye. It was Elsie Brewer who saw them first. She had risen early to tend her husband's grave, only to find 3 figures at the chapel's entrance, veiled, unmoving. Each held a candle. Each wore a different color of linen, white, red, and black. The fabric looked hand-dyed and ancient. The snow melted beneath their feet in small circles of steam. She said nothing. She turned and walked home, locked every door, doused every lamp. By nightfall, others saw the procession. The 3 girls walked slowly from the chapel toward the orchard, the candles in their hands glowing with unnatural steadiness. No wax dripped. No wind touched them. Behind them followed a line of shadows, dozens, silent and robed as if summoned from soil. They bore no faces, no steps, but the snow flattened beneath their passing. And above them, the sky took on a sickly hue, neither night nor twilight, but a stained shade of rust and bruised plum. The moon did not rise. At the center of the orchard, the girls stopped. There was no ceremony, no chanting. But every villager who later claimed to have watched from windows or from the edges of trees agreed on what they saw. The girls knelt. Each placed her candle in the soil. Then they vanished. Not all at once, but like fire snuffed beneath a bell jar, slow, shrinking, then gone. The candles remained. They burned until morning, but by dawn they too had vanished. In their place were 3 holes in the earth, small, perfectly round, smoldering at the edges. Fitch found them himself. He knelt beside the deepest one and listened. At first nothing. Then, faint from far below, he heard what sounded like breath. Breath not drawn in, but held.